On this episode of China Uncensored, what you don't know about the New York Times is killing people. Hi, welcome to China Uncensored. I'm Chappell. You know, the New York Times is one of the few foreign language news websites that actually is unblocked in China. Why is that? You know, the Times has been criticized for failing to report on the Holocaust. There's a book about it called Buried by the Times. During all of World War II, the story of the Holocaust made the front page only 26 times out of 24,000 front page stories, and in only 6 of those were Jews identified as the primary victims. Now it's the Chinese regime's genocide of Falun Gong practitioners in China that the Times is not only ignoring, but actually helping. Since 2001, there's been a sharp decline in any reporting about Falun Gong. Since the persecution began in 1999, only 164 articles have been written about Falun Gong, most of which were in the first 2 years. Not only did the numbers shrink, the tone of the articles they did publish dramatically changed after 2001. Considering Falun Gong is a persecuted group inside China, you'd think the stories would, be about China. But since 2003, not a single meaningful article about Falun Gong inside China was published. And it also seems to me if you were to report on a group suffering genocide at the hands of the Chinese Communist regime, you wouldn't use the Chinese Communist regime as your main source of information. But that's exactly what the New York Times has been doing. So before 2001, Falun Gong was described as a peaceful spiritual practice with roots in traditional Chinese culture that were victims of a, quote, propaganda blitz which recalls Maoist campaigns of the 1950s and 60s. But after 2001, suddenly Falun Gong practitioners began to sound like they were the bad guys. In a third of the articles the New York Times published about Falun Gong, they described the practice as a sect, or just used the Chinese regime's term, evil cult. And it's really stopped sounding like they were even being persecuted. In 2005, Jim Yardley of the Times wrote, Falun Gong is waging an aggressive campaign to publicize its allegations of mistreatment, which the Chinese government has denied. It is impossible to prove or disprove all of its specific allegations. The next year, evidence for the forced organ harvesting of still living Falun Gong practitioners became public. I guess, though, the Times feel that the burden of proof is on the victims. That's how a sane world works, right? But then they also started contradicting their own reporting. In 1999, when the persecution began, the Times cited figures put out by China that there were 70 million people practicing Falun Gong in China. But then in 2001, Craig Smith wrote that the number was made up by Falun Gong practitioners and that, quote, closer scrutiny suggests the movement in China never numbered more than several million. Which is funny because when he was working for the Wall Street Journal, he wrote, some government officials estimate that the number of followers has reached 60 million or more. He's also written that Falun Gong practitioners have died as a result of confrontations with the police or prison guards. Not from brutal torture of an all-powerful regime crushing dissidents, mind you, but just confrontation between police and what he describes as a sect that makes up numbers. I'm sure they just fell down the stairs. So if the Times is your only source, you get the skewed image that Falun Gong is a weird extremist group that on the one hand could very well not be suffering persecution, but also at the same time has been crushed by the Chinese regime. And it's really weird that there was such a big shift after 2001. I wonder what happened. You know, it's not like I have access to the inner workings of the New York Times or the Chinese government for that matter. But it does strangely seem to coincide with an exclusive interview the New York Times happened to pull off with Jiang Zemin, then leader of China and also the guy who started the persecution against Falun Gong. Then suddenly after that interview, the New York Times website became unblocked in China, and to this day remains one of the few foreign news sites to be so. In fact, Professor Jiao Biao said the New York Times is the only international newspaper available at Beijing University's library, and they just happen to be towing the party line about the biggest human rights violation of the 21st century. Pretty random coincidence, huh? I wonder if they make people in China pay to see their website, because I'm pretty sick of that myself. So from now on, if you're looking for China news, I suggest maybe not reading the New York Times. Once again, I'm Chappell. Thanks for watching this episode of China Uncensored.